Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this discussion, the Chauvin trial, Deconstructed: News, Identity, Equity, and Justice. This is a panel discussion exploring the Derek Chauvin trial through the lenses of news, law, and identity. And before we begin, I first want to say that I acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. So welcome, everyone. I'm Brad Gorham. I am the chair and associate professor in the communications department here at the Newhouse School at Syracuse University. Joining me tonight for this discussion are Professor Shelvia Dancy. Professor Dancy is a professor of practice in the broadcast and digital journalism department here at the Newhouse School. Before joining the Newhouse School, she was not only a reporter and an anchor in television news, but she holds a law degree from NC State. Also joining us, Professor Paula Johnson. She's a professor of law at SU's law school. She's also the co-director, of the Cold Case Justice Initiative, and was recently appointed to the Franklin H. Williams Justice Commission, which advises decision makers in New York State court system about issues surrounding litigants and employees of color. And then finally tonight, we're also joined by Dr. Ann Osborne, a professor of communications here in the Newhouse School. Professor Osborne teaches and does extensive research around diversity issues in media. So I thank you all for joining us, and I thank the attendees for joining us as well. And let me just mention that we will be taking questions a little later in the program, and also a reminder to mute your mic when you're not talking. But we'll be taking Q&A from the audience for the panelists a little later. But I've got a few questions for the panelists first. And first, I'm going to ask some questions related to sort of the broader social and legal issues surrounding this case. And then we can talk a little more specifically about the news media's role. And so my first question to the panel, and I'll direct this to Professor Dancy first. As soon as the verdict came in, one good friend of mine texted me and in all caps said, "Justice." But of course, like many of us in today's age, I immediately went to Twitter to see what other folks were saying about it. And I noticed a lot of people on Twitter saying, it's not justice, it's accountability. So Professor Dancy, what do you think of this? Is this justice? Is this accountability? Is there a difference? What do you think?
Like you, I also was on Twitter to see, like, what was in the atmosphere. What are people talking about? What are people thinking? And I saw justice in so many places. And I certainly understand where the heart is coming from with that sentiment. But in my personal opinion, I think justice implies that there's some sort of remedy for an action. Here, I don't think we do. I know that we don't have a remedy. There's a life taken. There's someone who will not be there for birthdays and Christmases, any special holidays. There will always be a hole in the fabric of a family and of people who knew and loved this person. Someone who existed no longer walks this earth, and that can never be remedied. So I personally think this feels more like consequences, more like accountability rather than justice. And I would imagine for anyone who knew and loved Mr. Floyd, there is no remedy for his absence, for the fact that he's no longer here. So I would think accountability would be the more appropriate word. Although I understand the impulse from people who say the word justice, I think this gets us closer to a system of justice instead of a legal system. But in my opinion, this is more accountability and consequences than justice.
What about the other panelists? What do you think?
Well, I will say that I think I agree with Professor Dancy's um, assessment of it. And I think that the only other thing I would add is that for me, justice would imply, maybe this is a small bit of justice for George Floyd's family and loved ones, but I don't think that we can call this justice when we, during the course of this trial, we saw the murder of one person in the midst of the decision being handed down. And so I don't think that we can call this justice when we are seeing one instance of one police officer being held accountable. And so
I think if I were to add to that, I would say that the reason we can't say unequivocally that there was justice here is because that depends on a system that is operating properly. And what we have seen in too many instances is that the justice system is quite flawed, particularly as it relates to Black and Brown victims of police excesses. And so the system is not working, and it is supposed to be founded on the rule of law. It's supposed to be founded on justice. And so the fact that in this particular case, someone was held accountable doesn't address the many other instances where we have to look at the systemic issues so that the system itself begins to live up to its name so that it is in fact a justice system.
That kind of leads into my next question, because I was reading this week, Professor Johnson, that over 1,000 Americans a year die at the hands of police, and we know that very few police officers are ever tried for murder in the line of duty, and certainly even fewer convicted of it. How do you think we should view this verdict? Is it a step in the right direction? Is it a step toward change? Is this an outlier?
Well, I think it's both. I think it is at once an outlier. I think that it can also be a step in the right direction if we are prepared as a society to move in that direction. And there is a lot of activity now. I think there's a lot of momentum for change, and that is to say for systemic change, as opposed to very idiosyncratic actions having to do with one case here or there that happen every so often in generations. And so what makes this case so unusual is that there was a police officer who was convicted of criminal offenses, 3 criminal homicide offenses, and that is just rare within our society, and particularly where the victim is African American. And so even in this era where there is almost the ubiquity of video now with cell phone cameras, even there, we have seen officers who have acted with excess have gotten off with charges with impunity. So this trial was different in that respect. Rarely are there indictments. When there are indictments, rarely are there convictions. And so in that respect, this was quite different. But because of the magnitude of what happened in the Floyd case, really the Chauvin case, it has captured the attention of the society, and I would, extend that, to the global community for just how egregious, just how inhumane the treatment was, such that it simply could not be ignored. And I think that because of that, there is a demand for more action to take place at every level of law enforcement in our society, local law enforcement, state and federal. And the Attorney General just announced that, in fact, there's going to be a review of police practices in Minnesota. Now that even in the midst of the Floyd verdict, there was another shooting, another fatality in Minnesota, less than 25 miles away from where that trial was being held. So we can hardly celebrate the result when there are still so many killings, fatal shootings of young people of color in the face of what has finally been found to be an accountable result.
Do you think the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act can lead to some real change in that regard?
I think that it can. I think, once again, it is a step in the right direction. Congresswoman Karen Bass is the primary sponsor of that legislation. It had already passed in the House. Its future in the Senate is currently uncertain, but I understand that there are conferees who are talking about this legislation to see if they can reach some accord on it. But I think it is a significant step in the right direction. It would do things like outlaw chokeholds. It would outlaw no-knock warrants. That was the situation in the Breonna Taylor case. And one of the major reasons why police officers tend not to face accountability in these cases is because of the doctrine of immunity, which they often have. And so even if factually they are found to be responsible, this qualified immunity doctrine will mean that they do not have to face the consequences of those findings. And so in that respect, they will be immune to any findings of responsibility. So this act, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, calls for the elimination of qualified immunity, and some of the other practices that we have seen have largely gone unremediated as it relates to excessive police force and violence.
Yeah, I was reminded as I was preparing for today that I actually started graduate school the year that the police officers who beat Rodney King, so that dates me some, but the police officers were tried and acquitted in California, and of course what led to protests all across the country. And again, we had a situation where we had video, but as I was reviewing what I remembered from some of my first graduate classes about media, the defense of the police took that video and broke it down frame by frame to basically show the jury that they didn't see what they thought they saw. And that was a number of years, that was several decades ago. Yeah. And so I wonder, I mean, many Americans saw the video of police officer Derek Chauvin with his knee on the neck of George Floyd for over 9 minutes. That video raced across social media. It was broadcast on broadcast television, cable television, across all sorts of digital platforms. Mm-hmm. And that video captured a man's final moments. I'm curious to know, news media rarely show the actual moment of somebody's death. Mm-hmm. And I think that brings up some ethical questions here, right? And I'm curious, and I'm going to first pose this question to Professor Osborne. What are some of the ethical dimensions for journalists here when you have a video like this, do you think?
Well, I think that, journalism's first duty is to inform and educate the public. And I think that in this particular case, that video was so very powerful, and it galvanized people, it galvanized the public to protest. There's really no doubt, at least in my mind, that Derek Chauvin would not have been convicted on all 3 counts without the video that Darnella Frazier shot, and she should be commended for her ability to do that at that time, and her composure. But we saw throughout the case that if it had not been for the existence of that video, that the defense tried to attack the eyewitnesses, tried to paint Donald Williams, one of the eyewitnesses, as an angry Black man and as an unreliable witness. And so I think that in so many of these cases, it comes down to the word of an institution, the police force, against the word of citizens. I mean, I will also note that it was remarkable in this case that you actually had police officers testifying that they felt that Chauvin was guilty. But that speaks to the power of these images and the importance of these images in being able to get a conviction. And as you know, this certainly isn't the first time that we've had video like this. I mean, I will say that for me personally, I think the last time I watched one of these videos in its entirety was Eric Garner's murder. And that was in 2014, I think. So I think that there is a real danger in the continual repetition of these videos. And I think that it causes real harm and trauma, particularly to BIPOC viewers who can see themselves and their loved ones in these images. I think there's also a concern about the repetition of these videos desensitizing particularly white viewers to the suffering and the death of the Black victims. So I do think that at a minimum, those 2 conflicting goals need to be considered. And I think at a minimum that there should be warnings that precede the videos so that people can opt out of watching them. I think oftentimes still images are sufficient to convey. And I think there is something slightly less traumatizing about seeing still images than the full videos. And the full videos can then be made available online. But that creates its own problems, because once these videos are made available online, they are passed around through social media out of context. And I think that is, again, particularly dangerous in the potential to desensitize the viewers to these videos. And so I think we need to always be reminded that we are watching someone's very last moments. And again, I choose not to watch any more of these videos. But I think their existence, we have seen, is incredibly important, though not sufficient, because Eric Garner was one of those cases where they chose not to even indict the officers that were responsible. So I'd be particularly interested to hear what Professor Dancy has to say as a news journalist on this topic.
I completely share your concerns about desensitivity, Professor Osborne. I reached a point myself where I can't watch them. It's just like, it's a televised death, and it's just, I don't know, I have to do some soul searching to watch it. It's just, one of the things that just breaks me down is the thought of, like, that is, I always think, like, behind these headlines that we write as reporters, like, these are people. That is somebody's child, that's somebody's uncle, that's somebody's nephew. And I could not imagine if that was my uncle, my brother, my dad. You know, if I'm just flipping the channels and out of the blue, I see them die again and again and again. Yeah, I definitely think there's a danger in desensitizing people to it. The damage it can cause, the trauma of just watching that, and also recognizing, I imagine there are a lot of people who were in similar situations, didn't lose their lives, but a video like that will take them back to something that they had to live through over and over and over. So I'm definitely aware of that and sensitive to that, to the danger of the video. And from a journalist perspective, I also think, I agree with what you were saying, basically that in so many cases, legal cases, the case boils down to he said, police said, he said, institution said, and that individual is always at a disadvantage. For better or for worse, people have this innate trust in law enforcement and the legal system, not saying whether it's deserved or not, but it just exists. That's just the way it is. And with video, we can see that sometimes that trust is misplaced, and it eliminates that having to pick a narrative to believe. You can have a video to decide for yourself whether the narrative that you're hearing from that institution matches the reality. And I do think, especially when it comes to people demonstrating that because they see these videos, they're no longer relying as much as they used to on official word and press releases and what does the police chief say. They're not even listening to that. People are like, look, I saw that video. I know what I saw and it was wrong. So it doesn't matter how many press conferences are held, how many press releases are issued. People can reach their own conclusions without having to rely on narratives that may leave things out. And I do think that's very powerful. And I personally think that galvanizes a lot of the demonstrations that we're seeing for regular people. It's a game changer seeing those videos and realizing that there is truth in a lot of the narratives that we have been told to ignore, and a lot of the narratives we have been told to discount. There's a lot of truth in those narratives. And I think the video is powerful for that. Naysayers, I mean, they can try to deny the video, but the video is still there and people can still make their own conclusions. And that is leading some institutions into territory that they don't want to be in because the video contradicts what they want the people to believe. And I think that's very powerful for people to be able to see the truth for themselves instead of relying on a press release or a press conference. And even for journalists, journalists need to question things too. The way that we innately question regular citizens, we need to have that same level of holding feet to the fire when it comes to institutions as well. And I think these videos help drive home that point for journalists.
Professor Johnson, it looked like you wanted to jump in too.
Well, I would say I would add this to what's already been said. And that is for us to be aware of why we might use the videos or show the videos. And I think that there are different contexts which bring about different responsibilities. So for instance, there's the news media, and then there is social media more broadly. And then there is in our educational context. So for instance, I teach criminal law and procedure. And there, in discussing these issues, there could be a value in showing the video. But in whatever context in which we're operating, I think there has to be the operative principle, and that is knowing why we are showing the video, because otherwise it turns out to be something just sensationalist and even worse, gratuitous. And if we're just showing it because it exists without any further purpose, then I think we're doing a disservice not only to the families of the victims and the victims themselves, but also to the professions that we serve. There has to be some guiding principle as to why we would do something that could be so traumatic, particularly showing something repeatedly. And so I constantly ask myself, if I am going to show something as graphic as that, what is my purpose? Is there some other way to do it? Do I need to show the entire video? And particularly since it's very likely that students and others have seen it elsewhere. And so do I need to pile on or compound that by showing it myself? And I have to constantly question that. And I'm very sensitive also to the matter not only of trauma, but also of the desensitization with respect to the harms that come to Black and brown bodies. And I've just become recently aware, for instance, that not far from here, meaning Syracuse, in one of the neighboring suburbs, that there's apparently a game that is called the George Floyd Challenge, where there are students, and I believe they're high school students, who are mocking this man's demise by putting their knee on other students' necks. This to me is such a hideous response to something that we're talking about, where we have actually seen the life that has been siphoned out of a man because the state's knee was literally on their neck. And so I think that there is a lot to be done, and I think it's in all of the realms in which we're talking about, because this desensitization and to consider something to be game worthy, I think is a reflection of how Black and brown people and our bodies have been regarded in the media, such that we haven't been considered wholly human. We saw the videotape of Rodney King. People, thought that, he just was not someone who could be subdued. So then you have this trope of a Black man who has some sort of superhuman qualities, even as you have some, 5 or more officers who are beating him senselessly. And so when you see those images, and when that is connected to all of the stereotypes about people of color, then that is the reason why when we are hurt, when we are killed, people don't see that as serious as it is. So we have to do something to counter those narratives and those images in that way.
Yeah, I especially hear what you're saying around how the narratives that the defense and defenders of police in a variety of these situations, those narratives, those frames are very reminiscent of stereotypes that have been deployed in other parts of popular culture as well for a very long time, whether we're talking. Oh yeah, go ahead,
sorry,
Professor
Brad,
Osborne.
or Professor Gorham. I would just add that I do think that that is where, again, the media's role about informing and educating extends to that during the trial, when we see the defense trying to paint Donald Williams, the eyewitness, as an angry Black man and trying to discredit him, the media have an obligation to point out that that is part of an ongoing narrative, that it is rooted in these stereotypes. And so I think that, and I think that we saw some of that. I think that with some of the commentary around the trial, we saw people being much more critical and recognizing, but that requires that you have people in the newsroom who know that history and recognize those tropes and those stereotypes.
Yeah, that it ties back to something that Professor Dancy was saying earlier, that there are lessons here, right, for journalists, because I mean the Minneapolis Police Department in the hours after George Floyd's murder released a press release that said man dies after medical incident during police interaction. And there were key facts that were left out, and certainly the facts that were in there, though technically true, were framing things very differently than I think how most people now view it. So what are some of the lessons for journalists here?
I think that's one of the biggest ones, that the same critical eyes that we bring to any statement that we get from someone who's not connected to law enforcement. We drill into students, attribution, attribution, attribution. You didn't see it, you weren't there, it's not gospel. You gotta tell the viewer, where did you get this information from? we need to apply that same line of thought to any statements from law enforcement as well. We weren't there, we didn't see it, we don't know that it's gospel. It's a claim, it's an allegation, it's something that somebody said, but we have to be careful not to present it as a fact. And I think it's too easy for people in general, but certainly journalists who are producing content that people are going to read and going to take as fact, to take those statements and offer it to the public without any critical eye, as though this is gospel, written down on a tablet, and let's give it to the people, when that may not be the case. And at the very least, we should treat it the same way as we would treat a claim from any other person. We write it down and we think, how do you know that? Let me ask you some questions. And then we present that to the people as something that somebody said. We don't just write it down as a fact and then just give it to the people as a fact. Even the way these sorts of stories are even written, I think can raise some problems. That narrative from the institution, the police department, is always presented first. And then later, sometimes at the bottom after an advertisement, you might see the viewpoint of the person who is the accused. And I always find that problematic. As a journalist, you certainly have to include what the institution says, but I kind of think in that same paragraph or the following paragraph, we need to hear from the other side. It shouldn't be buried at the bottom of the article that people aren't going to read in the first place. And so I think this case is one that shows that journalists need to be mindful that statements that we get from any institution, including law enforcement, can have holes, and we need to look for those holes just as we would if it was someone who didn't have a whole institution behind them. We shouldn't just take these statements uncritically, offering them to the public. There needs to be some analysis, just like we would apply to anyone else.
We've got our first question from the audience. Peter Ortiz asks, we've seen many police shootings where there was video and police were not held accountable, some of which we've discussed. It seemed, a major game changer here was the sustained protests all last year on behalf of George Floyd. Will we need to continue to see that level of public protest and those public demands for accountability in order to create systematic change in the justice system?
In my view, yes. I think that there is a role, an important role for public protest. Even with the video in the George Floyd matter, I don't think it would have garnered the same degree of attention had there not been the uprisings that we saw across the country and indeed around the world, who were so outraged about what happened that they demanded that the system be responsive and responsible as far as vindicating his death in that manner. Again, this was not a civil matter where you had, two presumably, equal parties against each other. In law enforcement, one of the reasons that makes this so important to address is that they have the imprimatur of the state on them just by virtue of having the uniform. And so if those who are supposed to enforce the law are found to be above the law, then that means that everyone else is at the whim of what law enforcement does or says is illegal, or what kind of punishment can be meted out. What essentially happened when George Floyd was killed in this manner was that he was punished with the ultimate punishment of death for allegedly trying to pass a fraudulent $20 bill. That is disproportionate in the extreme. And so we cannot let law enforcement not only be the ones who are supposed to be the arbiters of what is considered to be unlawful behavior, but also the ones who mete out the punishments. And that is what happens in these cases. So there has to be public protest that continues to put pressure on a system, not necessarily for a particular outcome, but to make sure that the system is responsive in the ways that it is supposed to be. And had there not been the video, had there not been the sustained public protest in this case, I don't believe that we would have seen this matter go to trial at all.
I completely agree with that. And I think it's also why we need to be incredibly concerned about efforts to criminalize protest. And we are seeing this sort of wave of states trying to put greater restrictions on citizens' ability to challenge the systems that are broken. And so
to follow up on what you were saying, Paula, about the lack of response, it's so shocking how nobody's fired until a video goes viral. Nobody's arrested until a video goes viral. Nobody's put on administrative leave until a video goes viral. And I think that's another case that shows the public how unresponsive systems can be. There's the public perception that there's some kind of violation and people are on it, law and order style. But in reality, nobody's on it until the eyes of the world are on Twitter or on YouTube watching some video. And it shouldn't take social media to get action. It shouldn't take social media to get accountability or some measure of justice. That's just insane. And to your point, Anne, I was just looking, I forget the state, so I won't say it because I don't want to misspeak, but I was just looking at USA Today earlier today. There's a state somewhere where they're looking at passing legislation that would make it lawful to run your vehicle into protesters. And so when we look at how arbitrary crime is, how one group of people decides what is a crime and what isn't a crime, and we've got recorded killings, and people are walking free, and we've got adults, elected officials, trying to make it possible for people to run into protesters with their vehicle without any consequences. I think that also underscores how arbitrary the definition of crime is and how arbitrary what is legal is. It's completely in the hands of people who are flawed and people who make decisions that are in their best interest, not necessarily in the public good.
Yeah, but it's also, but it's not accidental. I mean, there's nothing about this, that is happenstance, and that is why you have a movement that has as its basic, premise and affirmation that Black lives matter. Because what we have seen is that Black lives have not mattered in all of these major institutions in our society. And you can name the institution, and there's always been disparity, and there's always been a disproportionate response to things that affect our lives. And so when people took to the street and said, this man's life matters, that was the statement that made everyone have to take into account that we have to respond to this. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about Mr. Floyd is that he is really an everyman. He wasn't someone of tremendous stature, as we might commonly think of that. He had issues with his health. He had issues with substance abuse. He had been a professional athlete. He had all of these things going on in his life. And he could have been any one of our brothers or uncles or fathers or friends, but his life did not matter because he was Black. He was a Black man, and no one in the law enforcement institution cared enough that when he said, "I'm claustrophobic," that was not non-compliance with the police command that he get into the police car, but that he could be given some sort of compassion when he said that he genuinely had a problem. Right. And I watched as much of the trial as I could watch. And I certainly watched all of the closing arguments. And so in that respect, I saw some things repeatedly. But one of the things that struck me was that once they let him out of the back of that car, trying to fold his 6'3" or so frame into the back of that car, once he got out of there, he said with such relief Thank you. And you didn't see him try to dash away or somehow assault the officers. You next saw him sitting with his back up against the wall. He wasn't going anywhere. And so there is this way in which Black people and brown people are treated more harshly in every aspect of criminal justice and in other systems within our society. And so if we don't protest, these things will go unremarked and certainly uncorrected. And that is why people took to the streets to say this Black everyman deserves as much attention and respect as anyone else in this system. And we demand it. And we demand it.
That brings up a good point that, you know, a significant proportion of the public actually no longer trusts our journalism, right? Or they don't trust mainstream journalism or legacy news outlets. And so that means there's a significant proportion of the public who don't trust what journalists say about these things or write about the police or the victim here. I'm curious to know how you all think that the fact that, you know, there's so little trust now in mainstream or legacy news organizations. And of course, that's allowed for a rise of alternative media. Now, there's alternative media that focuses on some kinds of issues more than others. There are alternative media that do still hew to the tenets of journalism, right? Actually try to dig up facts and present them. And of course, we know there are plenty of alternative media that are a lot more freewheeling with the truth or lack thereof. How do you think this played out in this particular crime and public discussion about it, and then leading up to the trial itself? And what does this mean going forward, that so few, that we aren't operating on the same set of facts anymore? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think you just said it. I mean, we aren't operating on the same set of facts anymore. And but facts are facts, right? So it's not that we aren't operating on the same set of facts. It's that we're operating on facts, and then we're operating on interpretation and fabrication. And I mean, I think that we have seen in the last 5+ years just a remarkable fracturing of our country. And as Professor Johnson points out, none of this is new and it's not happenstance. I mean, these fissures have always been there. This country is deeply rooted in white supremacy. But we now have these sort of completely separate media ecosystems that are feeding these competing ideologies and driving us further apart. And I think it is remarkable how often you can see, and I imagine many of our viewers have experienced this, where you can be in a situation where you are sitting across the dinner table or in the classroom or in the office with someone who is seemingly working from a completely different set of facts. But again, they aren't facts, right? It is a lot of these alternative news sources are really engaged in conjecture, conspiracy, and flat out fabrication. And so without better media literacy, people have a hard time discerning what they can and can't trust. And I think it is also where we then see people relying on their implicit biases and falling victim to the deeply ingrained racist socialization within this country, and our perceptions of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And some of that, a lot of that is race-based, but then it's also compounded in this situation by the institution of the police force and these individual citizens. And so I don't have any answers, except that we need as a country, I think, greater media literacy. And I think that, in our history, we have had some stronger regulations through the FCC that sort of underscored the obligations of news media, and we've seen an erosion of those. And I think that has led us to where we are.
And to Anne's point about the popularity of conjecture and speculation, I think that makes it even more incumbent upon journalists, which I think all self-respecting journalists do anyway, but to really make sure that what we're giving people are facts, and to make sure it's in the atmosphere. You can lead the people to the facts, but they may or may not drink, but they're there. We still put them out there for those who want to hear, and maybe at some point the hope as a journalist is that the facts will crack through the speculation and the conjecture and the conspiracy, so that those who want to access it can, so that the editorial voices aren't the dominant voices, that the factual voices are the dominant ones. I think that's the role of journalists in a society like this now.
I have to say I'm a little distressed that right now it seems it's not just that it's that the conjecture / conspiratorial thinking / interpretation rather than reporting is popular. It's that it's profitable, right? I mean, there are people out there who are making a pretty penny off of pushing forward whatever statement, whatever conjecture is what they feel their base, their core audience wants to hear, regardless of whether it's anywhere approaching the vicinity of factual or not. And I think that poses a real problem, a real risk, because as you were just saying, how do we get audiences to value truth and value truthful and factual reporting more than they value getting what they want, right? It's almost like we have to get folks to want to eat their broccoli instead of eating the brownie at the end of the meal.
Well, they also have to recognize the difference between broccoli and brownies. And I think that that's a big part of the problem, is that to take a metaphor further than it probably should go, you can make some really tasty things out of broccoli and you can hide all sorts of things in the sweets. And I think that that's part of the problem, is that a lot of news consumers are actually consuming the commentary and the infotainment and thinking that what they're getting is news. And so
I think I would say also that as it relates to people of color, that we have not seen ourselves be properly or accurately represented in the mainstream media. And so it is said that nature abhors a vacuum. And so people will step into the void where they perceive that there is a space that is empty as it relates to seeing themselves properly reflected. Now there are some, of the more extreme aspects of this broader, reach or even categories of what we would call media now. But there has been this historical aspect of not properly covering matters that relate to people and communities of color. You mentioned the work, for instance, that I do at CCJI, which is the Cold Case Justice Initiative, and we are looking at unsolved racially motivated crimes that happened during the Civil Rights era. And as we have investigated those cases, what you will typically find is that the murders or disappearances of Black victims was generally not covered by mainstream media. And so where we have been looking for any of that information has been to go to the Black newspapers, where we would more often find something that was said about those cases. So all of the resources of investigative journalism were not put on the path in order to address, gaping holes and contradictions in the evidence surrounding the deaths of many Black victims. And so people have taken it upon themselves to tell their own stories, whether that is through the vehicle of video, of print media, or any of the other aspects that are at their disposal. And what I think that means for the rest of us, for everyone else, is that there's an obligation for us not to accept one source of information. I think if what is meant by media literacy is that people are more discerning about the information that they get, because they are looking at multiple sources and then trying to do that with a critical lens to come up with their own understanding, as opposed to being fed information and just accepting it, then that is something else. But I think that there are multiple dimensions to this issue, and we all can step up. Certainly the legal profession can, and journalism as well.
We have a question from one of our audience members. Suyon Hong asks, if Trump had won the election, do you think the verdict would have been different? I don't know who wants to take that on.
I don't. I actually don't. I think that there was so much foment for justice for George Floyd, that in fact it might have even heightened or intensified the demand for justice in this case. I do not imagine that those protests would have abated, and maybe particularly had Trump won re-election. But my own sense is that no, it would not have been different.
I tend to agree with that. I think what might very well have been very different is the response after the verdict. I think that in the same way that we saw white supremacists galvanized throughout the Trump administration, that we may have seen a lot more conflict, quite possibly egged on by Trump himself. And so I think that we may have seen a lot more conflict after the verdict, but that's just my speculation.
And I would like to think that the jurors, that if Trump were still president, would not make a difference. The video was just incredibly powerful. The prosecutors had such a strong case. There really wasn't much foundation for the defense to stand on. So regardless of who was sitting in the White House, the facts were what they were, and the video was what it was.
Yeah, I would like to think that too, especially because I think it's important to remember there was not just one video. There was the key video, right, that we all saw, but there were surveillance videos, there were body cam videos, there were other videos that bystanders took. So there was really a lot of video evidence about the whole thing. It would be nice to believe that it wouldn't be different. I don't see any additional questions from the audience, but so I'll pose this question. One thing I noticed the other day when the announcement came out, I first saw it from NPR that they were going to make the announcement of the verdict, and it was going to come out between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Eastern. And what I noticed on Twitter, as well as what I heard in the building from the few colleagues who are in the building these days, was a sort of collective, like, we're holding our breath. We're visibly nervous about what the verdict is going to be. What does this tell us about our system, that so many people were nervous about this, and especially that you saw from people of color a real palpable worry about about what the verdict would be? What does that tell us about where we are?
Our system is racist. I mean, it has shown itself again and again and again to be racist. And I think this goes all the way back to your first question. Is this justice or accountability? I think this is one case, and time will tell whether this is going to be a significant shift. But history has told us that there was a lot of reason to, despite the overwhelming evidence, to think that it was possible that he would not be found guilty.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking what it tells us is that, you know, the legal system lets us down again and again and again. You know, if it had let us down this time, I think definitely people would have been unhappy, but not surprised, because that's just the way that just is the way it is. We've seen all manner of people accused of horrific crimes walk free. We've just seen it over and over. And so my thought to your question, Brad, was that it just tells us the system lets the country down, lets justice down repeatedly.
And it lets Black people down repeatedly. And that has been the historical reality. There have been many cases where the evidence was certainly strong. And in this age of video tape, you know, Rodney King, for its day, was something that circled the globe. You know, even without cell phones, everyone saw those images. They really reached everybody. But nevertheless, there were acquittals, and that was owing to a criminal justice system and a society that was predisposed to exonerating white police officers for what they saw was the brutal beating of Rodney King. And we have seen that many, many times. So videotape really isn't the you know, dispositive factor in so many of these cases. It turned out to be the case here. It was, you know, so incontrovertible that it was almost impossible to think of an alternate response. But we have thought that before. And so there's great distrust. There's massive distrust in the system, you know, for those people who feel as though the system simply doesn't respond to our needs and respect our lives. You know, I clutched my own chest as I was waiting for the verdict. I had a visceral response as I was waiting for that verdict to come down, not knowing exactly what it would be, and frankly, being prepared for anything on Tuesday.
We've got about 2 minutes left, and I guess in closing, want to say what would you want the audience who's joining us? What can we do? What do you think is the best thing that individuals like us can do moving forward to help change a system that clearly many of us believe is broken? Professor Johnson, how about I start with you?
One of the first things that anyone can do and everyone can do is to be committed to being informed. And that is to be informed about people who are not like themselves, to know everyone's history in this society, and why the level of distrust is so great in all of our systems throughout this society. And once we know that on an institutional as well as on an individual level, then having confronted those realities, I think we can begin to change them. And so knowledge, I believe, is power. And knowledge, they say, if you know better, you do better. And I think that once we are committed to that, then we can make the kinds of strides that we need to make towards equality in this society.
Yeah, I like what you just said there, Paul, about people learning, getting that knowledge. And I would also add to that, I think people should be skeptical, question institutions, and not necessarily like in a, like, you know, just assuming they're all bad and they're wicked or anything, but understanding there can be flaws. Don't have just blind allegiance and just blind trust. In the same way that you would apply critical thinking skills to anything, you know, something a doctor tells you know, something a journalist tells you, apply it across the board. And I think that would go a long way towards making a difference. People being skeptical and acknowledging that we hope the best of people that we should trust, but sometimes we shouldn't. And there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that.
Professor Osborne, I think you have the last word.
Well, I think that I would say that the greatest onus for changing the system is on white people. We created the system that is flawed, that is broken, and we need to take responsibility for that. And we need to not be afraid to look at this country's history and all of its ugliness and acknowledge it, and then work towards change.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, attendees, for coming, and I hope you found this discussion valuable. I know I did. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the Newhouse School for putting this on, and let us hope that we don't have to do too many more panels like this. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.